So we respectfully acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the unceded and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. This presentation has been arranged by the Brockhouse Indigenous Studies Group, which has been going for several years. It has been our intent to contribute to reconciliation by educating ourselves on Indigenous relations and engaging others with the same intent. To this end, we are introducing speakers in this special pop-up events to include a wider audience among our members. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Cole Harris, who has for many years studied immigrant societies in early Canada and their relations with Indigenous peoples. He has a large and impressive body of work and is the winner of many academic awards. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and an officer of the Order of Canada. He is a professor emeritus of historical geography at the University of British Columbia. This is the second of two talks on his most recent book, A Bounded Land, Reflections on Settler Colonialism in Canada. The first, delivered on 28th of January, was recorded and is available to Brockhouse members in the multimedia page of our website. And today's talk will also be posted there soon. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Harris.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back with you people. Though I must say, I find it a little awkward being in touch with you electronically. I'm used to dealing with people in person, and I find lecturing to, there are a few faces up there, and there's a picture of Brockhouse, and there's a picture of me, but I find this rather awkward. However, you persevere and I persevere, and we will manage. Last week or 2 weeks ago, I was talking about Canada. And I guess what basically I was trying to say was that settler colonialism in early Canada was a bounded project, that a relatively small fraction of the land of Canada was available for active settlement, and it was very quickly taken up. That the rest of Canada was beyond the pale as far as most settlers were concerned. It remained exceedingly thinly populated, but that remaining scattered population was overwhelmingly Indigenous. And it is that Indigenous population on these unsettled lands that is speaking back to this country vigorously now, and that the country is really being required to listen to. And I think out of that listening, a somewhat changed Canada is emerging. I think what you're doing here in this series on reconciliation is a tiny part of that national listening that really is going on now. So I compliment you on what you're about, and it comes out of the particular circumstances, the very particular circumstances of this unique, rather baffling, but from my perspective, inherently fascinating country that we live in. But today I want to turn to our own corner of Canada, to British Columbia. And you'll find if you turn to this book of mine, that really I've tried to do two quite different things in the several chapters that are devoted to British Columbia. On the one hand, I've tried to say something about the making of an immigrant settler society here, how people coming from afar were put together in a particular way in this particular place. I don't think British Columbia quite fits the settlement experience of any other part of a more easterly Canada. I think this place, if it's to be understood, has to a considerable extent to be appreciated and thought out on its own, and that in some fair portion of what I've written on British Columbia in this book is what I was trying to do. But my other enterprise was to say something about the displacement of Indigenous peoples, and that is, I think, what I should talk about today. It fits with what this series is, and And I really don't have time to get into two quite different analyses of fairly related but different aspects of the British Columbian past. So today's talk is on really issues bearing on the dispossession of Indigenous people in British Columbia. I want to try and explain how it came about, what powers were at play that ushered in this dispossession. I want to try and explain, so far as I can, I'm not an expert on these things, but I have some hunches. I want to try and explain what the impact of dispossession has been on Indigenous people who had to live with its effects and try and work out lives in the rather torn apart fragments of territory that were left to them. And then at the end, I want to turn to the broad question, the broad contemporary question of just what we should do about this. So that's my agenda today. Today say something about dispossession, how it came about? Today something about its effects, and to say something about what we should do about it. But before I get into that, I want to make two broad general points. They are these. The first is that British Columbia is settled remarkably recently. European contact with Eastern North America begins at the end of the 15th century with John Cabot. It begins here almost 300 years later. This corner of North America, for those advancing from Europe, was exceedingly inaccessible territory. It was hard to get here. A huge ocean voyage was required, or an overland traverse that was equally difficult, which is why it took 300 years to get here. And when Europeans did get here, their first contact with the place was relatively sparing. Commercial capital arrives in the form of the maritime and the land-based fur trade. But this is not yet settler colonialism. People are interested in furs and in a trade to obtain those furs. They are not interested in land. They're not interested in replacing Indigenous people on the land. Quite the reverse, they require Indigenous people because they are the providers of the furs they are seeking. So it's really only after the creation of the proprietary colony of Vancouver Island in the early 1840s, or of the mainland colony of British Columbia in 1858, that we begin to see a settler society emerge in British Columbia. That's not very long ago. And so what we're dealing with is a recent European occupation of this place, a European occupation of this place at a time when, say, the industrial system was already well developed, when we're into the heyday of British industrial and imperial power. And the other general observation I would make is that accompanying and in many cases preceding the actual arrival of Europeans here were European diseases. And the first to come, as far as we know, was smallpox. And there is no doubt that there were beginning probably in the 1780s, there had been a sequence of devastating smallpox epidemics here. The epidemics of the early 1780s broke out in 1779 in Mexico City. From there, it spread north and south. As spreading north, it got into the Pueblo cultures of what are now the American Southwest. From there, it got into the horse cultures of the plains. It was spread very quickly by fleeing people through the plains. It got into the boreal forest. It went through the boreal forest. It really peters out only when it gets into the tundra, and the population density is so low that the continued dispersion of the disease was halted. Samuel Hearn, the chief factor at the York factory, said that it had killed 90% of the Chippewyans there. David Thompson reports, he wasn't there himself to observe this, but he reports what he's learned from an Orcadian, that is an employee from the Orkney Islands, an Orcadian employee of the company, that this employee had seen tents with dead people, the bodies being eaten by wolves, people in such a state of despair that they could not talk. And there's stories coming from the lower mainland. There's no doubt that these early epidemics got into the Cordillera. They got it to the mouth of the Columbia River, and from there they got into at least into the southern reaches of the Fraser River. I don't think at this early date smallpox was endemic throughout British Columbia, but it was certainly in the south. And there are horrific stories that we can glean from the Indigenous record. There's one from the Katsy of a family. They just produced twins, and so they'd been isolated. They'd been sent off to the hills, and they'd lived there. It was apparently the custom, if you had twins, you had to vacate the village. They'd lived in the hills for over a year. And when they came back, they found that the village was, well, everybody in the village was dead, except one child still vainly suckling its dead mother. So they toppled the houses, burned the place, and nobody would go near it again. There's stories like that. This place rests on a massive depopulation of Indigenous people. We don't know what the extent of that depopulation was, but the common, widely suggested figure for the rate of level of depopulation throughout the Western Hemisphere in the century after first contact is now held to be in the order of 80 to 90%. You know, we live in a society that is going through a huge upheaval because of an epidemic that's killing a small fraction of 1% of us. If you deal with 80 to 90%, it's a different story altogether. Anyway, those two background comments. Now I want to get into the question of the causes of dispossession, apart from this general epidemic that loosened things up enormously and created opportunities for Europeans that would have been more difficult, considerably more difficult, had a substantial Indigenous population still occupied this place. And again, one general observation, much of current academic writing on colonialism is caught up with the notion that at the heart of the colonial enterprise is what the literature calls a colonial cultural discourse. That is a discourse about European civilization and the barbarity or savagery of the rest of the world. And it's argued that, well, Europeans understood that Native people were either not using the land or using it very, very thinly. John Locke thought that it was labor that gave value to land, and that native people really weren't laboring the land, they weren't cultivating it, that they were sort of skimming the surface of the land, using it lightly. And because they were using it lightly, because they were not properly using the land, it was perfectly reasonable for Europeans to take it, to use it to their advantage, and in a way, in the more altruistic version of this rhetoric, to teach Indigenous people how to do it. I should say that I've always felt uneasy about cultural discourse theory, not because I think it's wrong, because it's certainly not wrong. These ideas are around, they're around in spades, but because it was too detached from the analysis of other modes of colonial power, that it was not possible, if one worked with texts and if one worked with the sort of the cultural signifiers in text, it was not possible to understand the relative weight of those texts, just how they played among other forms of colonial power. And I have always felt, rather, that it was important to start the other way round, to work not with texts and the cultural discourse that may or may not be embedded therein, but to work with the land, to work with the actual sites of dispossession. I am, after all, an historical geographer, to try and understand what was going on at that level. And as one understands that, to begin to discern the powers that were operating there and to begin to assess, hopefully, their relative weights, their relative significance. So that's what I have tried to do. And very briefly, what I will go on to try and do now is to summarize my thoughts about relative weights and relative powers of different forms of European ingress into this territory. Can we have the first map? Not an easy map to make much sense of, and I'll not leave it on for long. But those little black dots that you see, the little specks, those are Indian reserves. And all the rest of the land, you see, becomes crown land, is opened up for the use of non-Indigenous people. So what you're looking at is a geography of displacement. This was all the land of British Columbia, of course, prior to the coming of outsiders. All of the land of British Columbia was Indigenous land. And what Native people are being left with are these tiny pockets of reserves. They add up to 1/3 of 1% of the total land area of British Columbia. So there's a huge displacement of people from their land. And that's what I seek to explain. Why was that going on? How did it go on? How was that accomplished? That's the question. So take that. That is not a good version of this map. Find a much better one in the book. So please, would you take that off and let's just go back to where we were, which is better than that. Thanks. So how does this happen? One side of it is self-interest, but whose self-interest? Well, this is, as I say, this is late. It's 1850s and on. The world has shrunk. The time-space compressions ushered in by steam power, by the telegraph, are at hand. It's becoming possible to reach this remote corner of the world, and European capital, commercial and now industrial capital, are beginning to do so. And right where we are now, this peninsula is a perfect example of that. Here, in the early 19th centuries, was one of the great forests of the world. It didn't quite equal the biomass of the redwood forest of California, but it came second to it. After that, it was the largest, densest forest in the world. But it was here at Tidewater. And so it begins to be cut, and cut very quickly. From the 1850s on, the sawmills are in Burrard Inlet. And this wood is going out to the markets of the world. The place had become accessible. And what in a sense is going on in British Columbia over the years from 1850 on, well into the 20th century, is the expansion of accessibility as the tendrils of European expansion are able to reach into more and more corners of New World space, of British Columbian space. And as they do, they create the sawmills, the logging camps, the pulp mills, the mines, the whole array, whole gamut of industrial work sites that accompanied the ingress of industrial capital to this part of the world. So there's a huge opportunity in British Columbia for capital. Associated with capital, of course, is labor, which also often is locked into really quite bitter confrontations, bitter strikes with capital. But at a fundamental level, it's tied to the achievements and successes of capital. There won't be those jobs if capital does not have access to land. So both capital and labor are determined seekers of land in British Columbia. They need it. Otherwise they can't function here. They have to get a hold of it. They have to be able to control it. They have to manage it for their purposes. And as a transportation system with difficulty, to be sure, it takes some time to work into the interstices of this convoluted space. But as they do get into it, they reshape it in their own terms. And for their purposes, of course, they have to. Settlers too. Now, British Columbia is not primarily an agricultural settler colony, but there are pockets of agricultural settlement, of course, the Okanagan and the Fraser Valley and the Peace and other areas as well. And settlers are coming in seeking land for families. They want to create, well, a domestic opportunity. And in a limited way in British Columbia, they do. But they too require land. So the basic tension that runs through any settler colonial society, basic tension with Indigenous people, you see, is being set up. Herman Merivale, whom I mentioned 2 weeks ago, was dead right. There is a fundamental opposition within these societies between the interests of those who had been there before and the interests of those who are coming later. They're both interested in the same land. That's fundamental. So interest is driving. The interest of capital, the interest of labor, the interest of settlers are just driving people into this space and into the reorganization and the reutilization of it. What gives them the power to do so? In Washington State, just to the south of us, there was a succession of Indian wars, which the tribe after tribe, the Indians, indigenous people lost. Basically, they were up against modern armies. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, the American army was a powerful, organized, efficient fighting force. And that's what Native people dealt with and struggled against and lost to in the United States. Here we did not, there were no Indian wars on anything like that scale, but we came perilously close to them. In the Okanagan in the 1870s, as reserves begin to be allocated, and Native people begin to realize how much of their land they're going to lose, and as these wars are going on in the States, and there's a good deal of talk about actually going to war, and Native people are seriously considering it. But they knew that if they did, in the long run, they would lose. That they couldn't keep off a modern army. What had happened was that the British had realized that all they needed to do in a setting like this were the balance of power, the balance of sheer physical power, the power to kill people, rested overwhelmingly with them. All they really had to do was show that they had that power. And that would be the display of the capacity to kill would be enough to do it. And so there are, early on, when say a white shepherd is killed by some Cowichan people, there's a quick chase. There's captures of people who may or may not have been the murderers. There's a summary trial on the quarterdeck of a naval ship. And there is a very public hanging, as public as possible. Its intention is not just to kill somebody. Its intention is to demonstrate to watching Native people that they have the power to do this. Similarly, there are some shellings of Native villages. There's no way that a Native village could stand up against a gunboat. There's too much power there. And so you don't need very many shellings. After a while, all you had to do was send a gunboat up the coast. If there's a village that's giving the authorities trouble, anchor a ship close by and ostentatiously clean the guns. That'll do it. That'll do it. So there's a politics of fear in this, but it works. It works. And so with a huge imbalance of power, which there was, from the beginnings of European colonization in northern North America, there was were imbalances of power. But by the time you get to the 19th century and the late 19th century, that balance is enormous. Just especially when it's superimposed on a radically depopulated and in many respects demoralized population. So the capacity to move in is underlain by physical force. Doesn't necessarily have to be exercised, but it has to be demonstrated. And it was. And the justification for this comes back to colonial discourse theory, to the notion that Europeans were civilized and that native people were not. That therefore they really did not know how to use the land properly, that they used it lightly and fleetingly, and that people who had a far fuller sense of how properly to manage and organize and use land had therefore the right to do so. These ideas are old. They go right back to the beginnings of the European colonial outreach in the 16th century. They're variously modified through the years. I've mentioned John Locke and his labor theory of value, 18th century. In the 19th century, they're given a particular impetus by the power of the idea of progress. The idea of progress could be used in any number of ways. One could vaunt the improvement of morals or of religious conviction. But that's not what progress was normally directed at. It was directed at specific material achievements, at the ability to build steam engines, to build locomotives, to build fine china, and create fine china, and so on. If one thinks of progress in material terms, then it was just perfectly obvious to any observer that Europeans were a progressive people and that indigenous people were not. When some of the missionaries, looking at their flocks and looking at the rather ragtag bunch of Europeans around and thinking of moral progress, were not at all sure on which side of the fence progress lay. They rather thought that their own indigenous congregations had more of morality about them than the Europeans had. But if one's values are emphasized, the materiality of progress is a different matter. So I think that basically by the mid-19th century, this way of thinking about progress and about the European indigenous relations has taken a very strong hold. And all of this is enormously convenient for a settler society. It justifies that society. It doesn't explain why it's there. It doesn't provide the momentum to do this. It doesn't provide the power to do it, but it provides the moral justification to do it. And it can be even be seen in this light to be an altruistic thing to do, that one is bringing light, that one is bringing salvation, that one is bringing civilization and its putative delights to a barbarous people. These are gifts that Europeans are bestowing. So here's the basic scaffolding, if you will, of the settler colonial enterprise. It rests on interest, self-interest, the self-interest of capital, labor, and settlers. It rests on power, sheer raw physical power, the power to kill, even if that power is sparingly exercised. And it rests on a moral justification that is associated with the spread of civilization and the defeat of, or the replacement of savagery with much gentler, kinder, and more attractive, more civilized ways. So there's the background. But of course, when Europeans come into this place and begin to settle down there, then they've got to manage it. They've got to organize this space. They've got to arrange themselves in it. They've got to fit native people into it somehow. How are they going to do that? Well, I meant the good part of what I've written in this one chapter of this book deals with these strategies of management. And it's tricky. I don't have time to talk about it at very much length here, but let me just say a few things that quite beyond guns and gunboats and all of that, it was embedded in the type of civilization that came into British Columbia, a whole set of ways that were themselves aspects of the, as it were, the trappings of power that accompanied Europeans into this space. Let me just mention 4 of them. The first is maps. Europeans were map makers, but their maps, from the beginnings of European colonization in the New World on through to the period we're talking about here, were almost invariably egregious simplifications of the complex human geographies that had preceded this mapping, or that were there when this mapping began. Europeans could not handle it. It was too dense. It was too different. It was too foreign. But what they could do is pare it back, ignore most of it, put a few lines on the map, and begin to reorganize space in their own terms, in their way of thinking about it. And that is precisely what these early maps, are doing. They're enabling Europeans to get around in, to manage this space, to think about it in their way, within their mode of thought. I put one rather odd set of maps on a slide, and we might just look at that quickly. Yeah. Oops. Here we are. This is a map that one of the reserve commissions, the McBride Commission, prepared. It shows a set of reserves, of native reserves along the Skeena River. This is complex native space. It's been used for millennia, of course, by the ancestors of the people who lived there. They knew it intimately. They'd worked it in a huge variety of ways, but it's reduced to these simple bureaucratic maps. These are maps that the Indian Reserve Commissioners could take with them back to their hotel in Victoria, could put them together with the numbers that they'd collected, and could come up with some decisions about what to do for the Tsimshian Indians with respect to land, whether to give them a little more reserve land or not. So this is just a simple example of the map inserted in a bureaucratic process of land use management. So that's enough. Take that off and we'll go back to where we were, please. Yeah, good. The other, another instrument, as it were, at the disposal of Europeans, though we'd hardly think of them as a technology of power, were numbers. Numbers enabled Europeans to manage populations from afar. You can see this again with if you go back to the McKinnon-McBride Commission, you can see this operating with particular clarity. They go into to a reserve, they meet with elders and the local chief, and those elders and that chief would want to talk about their place, about their land use, about what their people had done with the land through the generations. And they could talk for days, of course. They're full of it. I mean, they knew this place inside and out, where the berries were, where whatever had happened. The Indian Reserve Commissioners couldn't handle such information. There was too much of it. It was too dense. It was beyond their capacity to organize. All they wanted was numbers. They wanted to know how many children there were of school age. How many children of school age were going to residential schools? How much land did they have that could be cultivated? Of that land, that cultivable land, how much was cultivated? That's all they wanted to know. They had assembled 4 sets of numbers. And they took those numbers, plus the maps like the ones I've just showed you, they took those numbers back with them to their hotel rooms in Victoria, and they decided what they were going to do for Native people with respect to reserve land, whether they were going to take off some land from their reserves, or whether they might give them a little more or leave them with what they had. Numbers were useful. Numbers seemed to be objective. They were transferable. You could base a calculation on them. And you bypassed, what you bypassed was that huge array of indigenous knowledge that surrounded the land, that gave it vitality and life for the people who lived on the land, but that the Indian Reserve Commissioners could not begin to use. Law. The law is a very convenient way of organizing information, organizing relationships between people, and holding those relationships in time through a considerable span of time. And also it has the capacity to transfer those relationships through space. So law has both a temporal and a spatial holding capacity that is considerable. When British Columbia is being settled in the mid-late 19th century, the older regimes of law that had turned around local custom, around myriad local ways of doing things, and particular use rights for particular parcels of land that were held by particular people. Most of this had given way to a much more generalized system of law based on private property and individual rights to individual parcels of land. The great legal theorist of the day, Blackstone, held that private property was an Englishman's most basic, most inalienable right, that an individual had a right to do whatever he or she wished with his or her property, that this was a fundamental right of any Englishman. These ideas about property come into British Columbia full bore, and they're not that old. They're not that old. And as I say, they've displaced an older regime of custom. And what is happening in British Columbia, of course, is the same thing, that again, they run into another older regime of custom. This time it's Indigenous custom. But with broadly the same effect. Just as, say, the villagers of the Western Highlands of Scotland were dispossessed of their land by landlords who wanted to take it over to run sheep, which they thought were more profitable, and put native people, and put Irish, put Scottish settlers on crofts along the coast, 3 or 4 acre crofts. So in British Columbia, Indigenous people who, like those Highlanders, had lived with considerable tracts of land which they'd managed in intricate ways, were being moved off their lands and placed on small plots of land, not crofts, but reserves. In some ways, it's the same thing. The difference, of course, was that in the Scottish case, or broadly the Western European case, these were arguments within established societies, within societies that by and large spoke the same language, saw themselves as part and parcel of the same broad cultural realm, probably practiced the same religion, and so on. But here, they were cast as a conflict between, to come back to the cultural discourse, they were cast as a conflict between civilization and savagery. And as such, of course, they is put in an entirely different register. And so it was that people whose ancestors in the near past in Britain had fought tooth and nail against the encroachment of the common law and the market and the dismemberment of local use rights, had become themselves advocates for the taking of land and the replacement of local use rights with common property rights in British Columbia. And this because for them, this had become not a squabble within a common culture, but a confrontation between two radically different peoples out of different historical circumstances, a confrontation between civilization and savagery. So the law is powerfully implicated in what is going on here. And then the final point, am I talking too long? I've got to be careful here. I probably am. Well, we're going to carry on anyway. The final point I would make is that as settlers move in, they are creating new settlements, new landscapes. They're creating a new human geography. And this new human geography itself becomes a powerful inhibitor of Indigenous ways. Could we have the last of those three maps, please? Good. Well, look at this. I mean, you recognize where you are. This is the Lower Mainland, and the black patches are native reserves. This is the local equivalent of that Bella Kula map I showed at the beginning. But you see there's a new survey system there. What is emerging is another geography, an entirely different geography. But it's a people geography. These are not just property lines. There are settlers out there. They're owners. There are people living on those, not all, this is early, this is 1876, but those lots will fill up. They'll fill up with people. And those people, to come back to the law, those people see themselves as well, property owners. It's their land. They can do what they want with it. And one of the things they can do with it is exclude people they don't want. They can exclude trespassers. And so what you have here is not only the emergence of a system of land granting, but also the emergence of a system of watching to see who is moving where. And that watching is backed by the capacity to not only to identify people who should not be on one's property, but to move them off. Because in the background is the state. And in the background are property rights, law, private property rights, and the power of the state. And so it's this property, law, state, and the capacity to dispossess. So you have a system of surveillance at a certain level. And in various ways, this is going on around the province as more and more of the ways of an immigrant society, the technology, the means of transportation, and the settlements that follow from that, those means, move into this huge angular space. When there are native reserves, say to go back to that first map of the tiny reserves in Bella Coola and Bella Bella territory, when there's no other settlement there, the fact that native people on those reserves doesn't mean very much. But when there begin to be others, or when there begin to be other allocations of land, when the forests are allocated in particular tenures, when the fish are allocated to particular canneries, then they do mean something. They mean a great deal. And it is, so the actual settlement of the place itself by non-Indigenous people becomes as powerful an ingredient in the dispossession of Native people as everything else put together. And it powerfully channels where Native people can go and where they cannot. So where are we now in relation to my agenda for this talk? I've tried to explain the broad scaffolding of powers that underlie the resettlement of British Columbia. And I've given you some suggestion, I hope, of the technologies available to immigrant settlers to organize land and to facilitate the managed dispossession of Indigenous people. The next question is, how do Native people handle this? What are the implications of all of this? Well, what ensues is an attempt on the part of Indigenous people to make lives work in these constrained circumstances within the new geographical reality that is imposed upon them. By and large, the reserves themselves are insufficient. They're too small. There's almost no agricultural land in these reserves. There's very little forest land. Some of them have access to modest fisheries, but overall, the reserves are far too small in themselves to support the populations within them. So one has to get out beyond the reserve. And for a time, as I've just suggested, the older lands are at least somewhat available. And when many of the older seasonal resource procurement strategies were still open to Indigenous people. They could still hunt and fish approximately as their ancestors had, but only for a time. As this new geography, as this new world of regulation and land management settles around them, it becomes harder and harder to do so. There's more and more constraints. There are new trapping licenses, new timber leases, and so on. And so the old seasonal round becomes, never in most cases is entirely gone, but it gets more and more fractured. And only edges of it after a time are available to most Indigenous people in most places. There is the alternative of wage work. There are these new industrial work sites. They're canneries, they're sawmills, they're pulp mills, they're mines, and Native people get into them, of course. But they get into them usually at the bottom of the wage scale because they haven't often the prior skills. They're also competing with male labor forces that were very mobile, hired to do particular jobs and could easily be moved around to different places in the province. As for example, Chinese crews in the canneries. These were single Chinese men. Their women are very often in China. They're a mobile force that can be labor force that can be moved wherever. around the canneries of British Columbia. In the mines of the interior, there were very often, the labor force very often was a moving array of single men traveling through the mines, looking for work, finding it for a time here, then the mine closes, they move on. Some of them are married, some of them have wives cached in one or other town, but very often they don't. They can't afford it. They can't organize work and wages and livelihoods in such a way as to keep a wife with them. Native people are dealing with these workforces from a particular vantage point. They do not have the luxury of working full time. They have to try and hold on to some fraction of their former ways. It's too risky to put all of one's eggs in these new industrial baskets, especially as the mines and the canneries and so on open and close. They're tied to the vagaries of international commodity prices, changes in technologies. And so it is a precarious business to commit oneself to full-time, year-round, year after year work in a cannery. That cannery is going to close. There'll be economies of scale, and the canneries are going to shift to, so eventually most of them will be at Steveston. And the up coast canneries are gone. So it's a precarious business, but Native people are trying to juggle all of this. And as far as I can see, sometimes it worked. Sometimes they're getting by. Sometimes Native life is not too bad. And sometimes it isn't. And when it isn't, Native people are virtually starving. And life is exceedingly hard. People are hanging on by a thread. And the basic reason why they're hanging on by a thread, of course, is that they have been detached from the overwhelming majority of their land. And they've been detached by the means that I have described. So finally, what do we do about this? What do we do about this? Here we are. The first thing, I want to make several background points. The first thing I would say is that it's awfully easy to point fingers and blame. The usual blame is this or that government or this or that official. In British Columbia, as reserves were reduced in size, it's common to blame Joseph Tretch, the Indian Reserve Commissioner who succeeded Douglas and reduced the size of most of the reserves. I don't find Joseph Tretch attractive in the least, but Joseph Tretch was a representative of the overwhelming majority of British Columbian society. There were only a handful of people in British Columbia who didn't agree with him. British Columbians bought in entirely to the notions of civilization and savagery, to the notion that they were part of a superior civilization, that Native people were inferior others. And so when you're talking about whom to blame, I think one has to shift the blame away from particular individuals and recognize that one is dealing with the whole society. And I think one probably needs to recognize too, that it's not just a society in the past, those who went before and those who were active in these early dispossessions, but those of us who live here now, including me, including you, including all of us. We all live off the avails of settler colonialism. We have our own lands or our own apartments. We're free to travel around in this place. We're all impinging on Native territory. We have to keep that in mind. It's awfully easy to find blame, but we are all implicated in this. There's no getting away from it. The second thing I'd say in a general way is that I cannot see how, after Europeans made the discovery of the New World, how they could have stayed away. The imbalances of power were too great. The attractions of land for the population pressure in Europe was rapidly growing. Attractions of land were enormous. The energy of commercial capital was huge. The rivalry of European states was intense. Once the isolation had been broken, not only diseases were going to come, but people were going to come. If particular groups of people had stayed away, others would have come. If we had not come, or if our ancestors had not come, others would have come. One's not going to solve the Aboriginal issue by going away. We're here with it. We live with it. It's part and parcel of what we are. The other thing I would say, and this may be a bit uncomfortable, is that wherever there are imbalances of power, as there were in this case, I think there's a tendency for those who are on the advantage side of that imbalance to exercise it. The Native people did as well as we. The last great migration of Indigenous people prior to the European coming in northern North America was the migration of Thule people from northern Alaska across the northern Arctic and eventually well down the Labrador coast. It took about 1,000 years. It advanced over a prior culture, the Dorset culture. It was able to do so because the Thule brought a superior technology, superior housing, superior whale boats, superior flotation, superior dog sleds, and they displaced the Dorset. They either killed them off or they intermarried with them. In any event, after a time, the Dorset were gone. There are other examples. The Native people are, Indigenous people are people. They're not angels. They have their foibles as all the rest of us do. Anyway, with those initial comments about at the conclusion, what else can I say? I do think we have to return a good deal of land to Native people. 1/3 of 1% of the land of British Columbia turned over to Native people is not enough, not nearly enough. I think we probably need to recognize that our use of this land over the last 150 years has been pretty bad, that we've damaged an enormous quantity of land, that our forests are nothing like what they were, that our fisheries are nothing like what they were. And it may be that Native peoples have a greater capacity than the rest of us to engage in the restoration of some parts of these lands. They had lived with them in fairly balanced ways for eons of time. They also had intense, well-developed knowledge. These were knowledge-based societies. Their knowledge was local, but it was intense, it was impressive, intense, the intricate knowledge of local resources, of local plants and animals. No subsequent people in this country have come close to matching that. But maybe that not only in justice do we need to return some land, but in terms of the health of that land, that Native people may be able to do things that we have far better than we have done badly. I think we have to return a fair measure of government to Native people. Just how far is going to have to be negotiated. But I think that, and this touches on one of the points I was trying to make last day, I think that this country that has not been preoccupied so much with individual as with collective rights is in a position to do this more easily than a country that has not been so preoccupied with collective rights. We've had to figure out how to deal with Quebec. We've had to figure out to some extent how to deal with the very different peoples who lived in different parts of the Maritimes. We face the same challenge in figuring out the appropriate level of government for Indigenous people. And we have to figure out what the relationship of these governments is to be to the Canadian state. I myself don't, there's quite a body of Indigenous opinion will say that what one wants is fully autonomous, Indigenous societies, independent Indigenous nations. I myself think that that is not a desirable solution. I think we have to work out something within the framework of Canadian society. I agree there's a very important book written 15 years ago now by Alan Cairns, political scientist at UBC, Citizens Plus. He argues the case for a particular relationship with Native people, but not a completely independent relationship. He argues that, for example, our ideas of citizenship would be compromised and that would be serious. Well, I don't have time to get into any more. But look, what I'm trying to say in all of this is that what you people are struggling with in this series is important. I commend you for doing it. But don't expect that you're going to find simple solutions. You're not. These problems are bedded deep in what we are as a society. They're not going to go away. There are fundamental contradictions and imbalances worked into the very fabric of settler colonialism. We are part and parcel of that, of settler colonial society. And in many, I mean, I'm proud of some of the things that settler colonialism has done in this country. I am a product through and through of settler colonialism. I've studied some settler, spent my early years studying early Quebec and fascinated by and impressed by, and I know how hard it was for these people coming out of France in the 17th century to create new lives along the Lower St. Lawrence. How impressive it was that they succeeded at all. Different things, different agendas, different ideals are running into each other. There aren't simple solutions, but one has to keep working at it. And the directions of change that I've intimated towards the end seem to me those that lie ahead for us. And I might just say finally that I have the sense that we are moving in the right direction. I'm not as bleak about this as some people are. I know we're not going to find final answers, but I also think that compared to even say 20 or 30, a generation back, things have moved in this country. And I think they've moved quite a lot. And I don't see how that movement can stop. So I'm both overwhelmed in a sense by the problems, but also in some ways encouraged that this country does have the wit to begin to figure this out a little more effectively than it has. Well, I don't know. That's enough. Thank you very much. I've talked for too long, but there you are.
Well, we're open for questions. I don't know,
Okay.
Maybe I can just start with something that I was thinking about. I was up in the Chilcotin a few years ago, and that was just after, one of the land settlements up there, and the settlers up there were very, very worried about what was going to happen to them. And it seemed like imminently something was going to happen. But when I talked to some other people, they said it was mostly crown lands that were given over. But do you think that something like leasing arrangements could be managed in situations like that? Yeah.
I say I can certainly understand the apprehension of people living close to, an agreement such as the Chilcotin Agreement. But in a sense, you see, it's the same problem everywhere. To the
Yeah.
extent that one returns land to native people, it's taken away from non-native people. And as when our economy turned, as it largely did, on primary resources, well, we seem to be just, curtailing our own economic opportunities. One of the things that's happening, of course, to the Canadian economy is that it's the percentage of our gross national product that's tied to primary resource industries is dropping, and dropping fast. And a somewhat different economy, an information economy, is emerging. And that takes some of the pressure off the retention of these these lands close to tied to resource industries. So it may be easier to give a bit of it back. But I don't know the details of the return of land. But I suspect that a whole set of different procedures will be followed, from the outright return of land to various leasing arrangements, to various co-management schemes. I'm not an expert on any of this. I have no wisdom to offer in that regard, but there seems no reason why any particular template needs to be imposed on the country. There should be many different ways of increasing Indigenous access to land.
Yeah. I see that Conrad Galkey was wanting to ask a question. Conrad, will go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Cole. I was curious, in terms of moving across Canada, there were a series of treaties. It appears that there were treaties to the east, and then suddenly they ran out of treaties, and they had this other way of, wherever they found communities, they put a square around the map and decided they were bands. Is there any difference between what is happening in British Columbia and the rest of Canada in respect to the basic relationship with the Indigenous peoples?
Oh, Conrad, it's good to be in touch with you again, by the way. Nice to hear from you. And I know Conrad's brother exceedingly well. Conrad, how can I answer that question briefly? There were treaties on Vancouver Island in the 1850s. Douglas instigated them, but they were for small tracts of land. And when the Crown Colony of British Columbia was created in 1858, and there was suddenly a mining rush, it became impossible, or at least from Douglas's vantage point, it became impossible to negotiate treaties. There were too many different native groups. There was too much territory. The gold rush was too uncertain. It was unclear where in heaven's name it was going to go and with whom you should be treating. Douglas had found that the last treaties he made on Vancouver Island had been quite arduous affairs. It took him a year or so to negotiate each of them. And so there was just, he didn't have the bureaucratic muscle. He didn't have the time. He didn't have the money to negotiate such treaties. So the whole treaty system was turned over, in Douglas's mind, into a system of allocating generous reserves. He thought that if his agents got out there quickly and allocated reserves before the land was claimed by settlers, and if he gave native people essentially what they wanted, that this would stand as a fair alternative to the treaty system. And he embarked on that for several years. But of course, when Douglas retired, as he did in 1864, his successor, Joseph Trutch, whom I mentioned, and behind Trutch, settler British Columbia, that had basically been appalled by these reserves that Douglas was creating, thought that they were ridiculously big, and either withdrew them or, more commonly, shortened them greatly. And so, except in the north, where one of the treaties that you're talking about, Treaty 8, there's a whole set of them. I think it ends with, what is it, Treaty 11, by which time we're in the Yukon. The northeastern British Columbia is within the domain of Treaty 8, but the rest of British Columbia is land for which you're right, there are not treaties, and nor, for that matter, are there the large reserves that Douglas was hoping to create. And so you do have a special set of arguments in British Columbia that go back not to the meaning of particular treaties, but to, because in the absence of treaties, go back to the question of inherent rights, whether stemming from the Royal Proclamation of 1763, there isn't a process for the allocation of land to Native people, or the removal of land from Native people, that process has not been followed, and that therefore Native people are still the owners of this land. And that's what the court cases that we've been seeing in British Columbia from Delgamuukw on have been about. And what they basically established is that there is a residual Native right to land, but the question of just exactly what that residual right is has been contested by, this was Delgamuukw, has been contested by a series of subsequent court cases. Of one of the last of which, I guess the last of which, is the Chilcotin case that was just referred to. Anyway, Conrad, this is a huge question, and it underlies the litigation that there's been in British Columbia for the last 30 years on these issues.
Thank you.
With when you did your first talk, you talked about the population being pinched and really squeezed by the Canadian Shield and the cold. Mm-hmm. And I've been reading some articles recently about climate change and how, you know, as it gets warmer and the warm is pushing up north and there's going to be more agricultural land, and how much Russia will be able to capitalize on this, and of course Canada. How do you see that as perhaps impacting on this question?
Karen, I'm no expert on these things, but if you'll allow a bit of a sort of egregious offhand speculation.
That's what I want.
I would say, Karen, that we're solving one of the problems of boundedness in this country. We're warming up the climate, but we're not solving the other problem of boundedness, which is rock. And I mean, much of the Canadian Shield, however warm the damn place gets, is still rock bound. And you're going to have an awful time putting agriculture in much of it. It's also, as you get a little farther north, it's underlain by permafrost. And that permafrost will melt, but it may take hundreds of years. I mean, even in a pretty balmy climate, it's going to take a long time for that to melt. So I am not expecting, other than, I mean, greenhouse agriculture may be able to do quite well, but a larger outdoor agriculture across much of the Canadian North, I hate me dudes.
Oh, you have. Oh, you're probably right to have your dudes. Anyone else?
Can I throw in another observation? Just Cole, the point you made about numbers, I think is huge, huge, huge. Because I mean, while the colonization of Canada was happening, you were also having the scramble for Africa, if you like. Mm-hmm. But there was a disparity of numbers which have come home to roost in the last 50 years. And so Africanism has been, if you like, decolonized in a way. And do you see the numbers coming back at all in Canada? Is the population growth amongst Indigenous communities keeping pace with that of the rest of the country?
Well, you're absolutely right. The epidemics hang behind this country. They do. They transform the terms with which Europeans and Indigenous people would have engaged each other. Not only were the numbers enormously reduced, but the confidence of Indigenous societies must have been largely compromised. the elders had been killed off to a very large extent, and they were the keepers of the wisdom, the lore, the history of these societies, and just these extraordinary death rates. I know that, well, one of the people that David Thompson talked with on the plains when he got there a few years after the epidemic, told him, this old man shaking his head, that their society could never be recreated, that the way of life of his people was gone. And there were people on the coast saying, old men, well, elders just shaking their heads and saying, telling the whites that whites had never seen their societies when they'd been at their full, their full expression. And again, it's really a way of life had gone. The epidemics had taken it off. So yes, the epidemics they underlie this country in deeply powerful ways. And what was left behind were residual populations that were tiny. The first census we have of British Columbia is 1881. And in the whole province, I'm sure the census takers missed some people, but still, they got most of them. In the whole province of British Columbia, there were only 50,000 people. 1881, that's not that long ago. And of those, only 25,000 were Indigenous. We will never know what the Indigenous population of British Columbia pre-European coming, pre-epidemics was, but it must have been in the several hundred thousands. And so, yes, it's, I mean, the terms have been radically changed. Now, what is happening is that Indigenous populations are growing exceedingly rapidly in this country. Mm. They're growing rapidly because, well, the checks in many parts of the country, not so much in British Columbia, but in the north, the barren north of this country, the checks on population, which were basically biological. The land didn't produce much food, and it could only support, therefore, a fairly small number of people. That biological check on population has been bypassed by and large, but well, to some extent by industrial work, but more often by federal financial support in the form of welfare payments of one sort or another. Usually they're pretty parsimonious welfare payments, but still it's enough to keep people alive. And Indigenous birth rates are high. And the largest among people resident in Canada, the most rapidly growing population at the moment is our Indigenous population. It's just about at 5% now, and it's growing rapidly. I think in Manitoba it's 10%. There's some forecasts that I don't know what the date is, but within the next several decades, there may be almost approaching a majority Indigenous population in Manitoba. There's a huge drain because the North can't support the people who are living in it. There's a huge drain of Indigenous people southward into Canadian cities at present time. And that is happening in British Columbia too, as people move out of northern communities where work is limited into Vancouver, often into the downtown east side.
Thank you.
I think that I think unless there are any more questions, I think we have come to the end of today's talk, which I very much regret because I was enjoying it so very much. So in closing, I'll just give you a quote from the book here. And it's one that kind of resonated with me. If we better understood the tensions inherent in an immigrant society and realized that immigrant opportunities in this remarkable place have always rested and continue to rest on the displacement of Indigenous people, we would, I think, live here more thoughtfully and much more gently. So with that, I would like to thank you so very much for joining us today. And we very much appreciate it. And I very much appreciate your book. And we are certainly going to be studying more of that in our Indigenous Studies group. Thank you so much, Cole Harris.
Well, thank you.
Yes,
It's been a pleasure.
it's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks.